And so this is something that can be really hard for a lot of poker players to accept if they want to accept it, is that, we want to feel like we're super smart when we're playing poker. Like we're so like I can do better than like a simple protocol of like just bet your bluffs like half the time or 70 whatever. I'm smarter than that. I know the blockers, I know the situation, yada yada yada. Most of the time, simple protocols and especially on early streets are just going to outperform, whatever Linus or whoever would really attempt to do.
Many players who are listening to the podcast are probably now very motivated to start to deliberately work on their game. Often players don't really know what to work on. So 2 questions. How should people go about, and how do you go about finding your leaks? And then how would you best work on improving those?
Okay, so for individual people, I know I have a very specific, highly regimented, highly logical approach to the game that works for me, and it's a routine and a style that I've cultivated over years. It's not going to copy and paste to everybody, and I think there's some people that are just very intuitive that would not really want to sit down and think that hard about all of this different stuff, or to do it in quite this way. So that's why in the beginning I'm really emphasizing on finding coaches or study material or whatever it's going to be that really works for you. So as long as you are putting in some level of effort to try to cultivate a routine, I think that's the most important part, because this is something that I've developed through iterations that has worked for me. Finding my own leaks, I mean, one of my favorite tools is Hand to Note. Um, Hand to Note is basically a tool that can really comprehensively help you review your database. So I can essentially import all the hands I played, let's say on like ACR, and it gives you some very detailed pop-up stats of all the different, basically the way you play in every different situation. So I have a tab for like, here's how I play in 2-bet pot in position pre-flop raiser. So let's say if I'm button versus big blind, right? And then here's for the turn. Here's on the river. Okay, now what if I'm calling out of the big blind? Okay, 2-bet pot out of position pre-flop caller. Here's how I'm defending against c-bet. And not just how I'm defending against c-bet, here's how I defend against third pot, half pot, 3/4, overbet. And next to that stat, let's say it's like I'm folding versus 1/3 c-bet 35% of the time or something, I'll have PO solver's number, which I figured out, or that Pat figured out through doing multi-flop aggregation reports in PO. So I can compare what I'm doing to what PO Solver is doing, and I can get a sense of like, okay, at the bare minimum, my frequencies are basically correct here. And also have a strong sense of what the range compositions would be in each of these. So Hand to Note can also help you see like, okay, here's how often I'm check raising a set or 2-pair or whatever. And so you can get a sense of like, okay, I'm relatively balanced in this area, so I'm playing well. I don't need to study this as hard. But let's say like, oh, I'm overfolding versus the half pot, by like 2% or something or 3%. I mean, even for me, any small amount is an error that's intolerable, right? So it's like, okay, I know maybe I'll write that down in my notebook, okay, overfolding versus half pot, and I'll set that intention when I'm going into a session of like, okay, just remember to, kind of calibrate a little bit with versus the half pot bets. And so I basically have the entire game tree sort of mapped out in Hand to Note of like every basically common situation, how often I'm using different sizings and comparing that to PO Solver, and how well I'm defending against bets across the entire game tree. And I'm constantly figuring out like if there's a leak to plug, I'm going to leak it, or I'm going to plug it, and focusing on that specifically. So if I'm basically if I'm overfolding or under bluffing or under raising, I try to get to that as quickly as possible, and start steering it in the right direction.
Are there then also maybe some situations, usually if I look at my own game and I'm deviating, like, or for example, I put a hand in Wizard or something and it says, hey, minus 2 BB play. I'm like, okay, yes, but like some deviations are on purpose, right? Like the goal is not it depends obviously the level. I mean, you play 25-50 against some of the best in the world short-handed, then you better be very accurate. But
Yes.
it doesn't necessarily mean that if you deviate in a certain node, Like basically it should just raise your awareness, but like, hey, you're deviating here. Do you have a good reason for that?
Sure. So you might have personal targets. You don't necessarily have to use PioSolver
Yeah,
as an
exactly.
example, but you have a target range of what you want to be in each different zone and try to aspire to do that.
Yeah, maybe you're playing 2 GTO in a spot where you should be
Sure.
more out of line, for example. I think we touched on that a little bit previous in the podcast as well. But in terms of improving your leagues, like I'm sure you've seen monitors. Maybe you've done it yourself. I've done it myself, where you're just like, I don't know, call river, fold river. You hang like these notepads telling you that you should do something.
Oh. Okay.
But sometimes it doesn't really work, or most of the times it doesn't really work. You have to, when you spot a leak, you have to find the origin of the leak. So for example, let's say you overfold in a certain spot. Well, that might be because your range composition on the previous street is not well done. So basically, if you just say I should call river more, but every time you have nothing on the river because the way you construct your range, just calling more might actually not be a very good solution. It's actually a leak on a previous street that makes you fold river more.
That's exactly where the strategy development comes in, though, of why I focus on like, okay, here's how I'm going to play a balanced range, relatively speaking, on each street. So I know it pays off. It just makes me so much harder to play against in general because so much of it winds up being sort of premeditated in a way of like I play a good flop stab range. So it just extrapolates that. It's kind of harder to play against me by the time you get to the river. Like if I check back the turn, I'm going to have just kind of a much stronger range than if someone's not protecting as much.
Yeah, so basically in the report, you see, okay, I'm deviating here from theory. Then you might open a solver, look at the range. Let's say the half pot bets. Oh, is it simply because I'm missing the hands with these type of heuristics as a call? And like you said, you go in game. Most probably then if you're like, I have that as well. It's like, oh, I know I should call more. So then there's like a spot you feel like, it's close. Oh, this is exactly one of the spots where I clearly overfolding. So my intuition says it's close, but actually I'm overfolding. So probably everything that's close, I should just move to call. It's a relatively easy spot to fix, but yeah, it becomes harder when, for example, you go to this later street, and you're like, okay, so Pio raises his hands, calls his hands, and they're like, wait, but I don't have these hands. You have to be realistic with yourself as well there. I think it's very easy to just be like, oh yeah, okay, but forget the fact that you never have those hands in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's what makes. So I use the drill feature in GTO Wizard really often as well. So if I see, okay, like I'm overfolding versus a half pot c-bet or whatever, I have tons of different drills with color-coded tags that I go to pretty frequently. And so maybe I'll pull that up of like, okay, I'm going to go through 20 of these and then just as a refresher. And then like you said, like if you're in a spot where it feels close and you know that's like your leak, it can make sense to kind of defer towards maybe calling if your leak is overfolding because you're basically sort of calibrating for a bias that you have because you might have a bias that is weighted towards folding and you adjust it by kind of overriding it a little bit when you get that feeling like, okay, this is really close. Because if you were able to intuit what was truly close, you wouldn't be overfolding. So your meter is probably a little bit off in that scenario.
Yeah, and basically by doing the strategy creation, you build better intuition. So next time
by the repetition,
your intuition becomes more correct.
Mm-hmm. It's just a ton of drilling, but yeah.
Yeah, a ton of drilling. Do you have like? Because then what I sometimes would struggle with, like, so I feel like I know something then, and then I'll move on to a different point. But if I don't pay enough attention to the other point, the leak might start to come back. Have you experienced that?
So called whack-a-mole.
Compared to like let's say for example you build a wall, right, to hold back the water, and at some point a little hole comes out. Well, you've identified the hole, so you stick your finger in it, and they're like, or you put something on it and you work on a different hole. But if you don't pay attention, the other hole opens up again. But
you are describing
like I've kind of accepted that holes will always exist.
Well, yes. I mean, you are describing essentially the marquee problem of like coaching small stakes players. First of all, like that's always going to be a thing that would come up is trying to play whack-a-mole with all these different leaks. I mean, part of why I study so goddamn hard is to minimize how many leaks that I might have in my game, but poker is so complicated that course, you're never going to be perfect. There's always going to be something that you have that's, exploitable. But that's why I value the simplified strategies and try to simplify things when possible and not get, I'd like to use as few sizings as possible in any situation, so that I can more reliably, get to the river while losing as little EV as possible.
Yeah, so basically then your river decisions become, or at least because your range is better intact, it's easier
Yes.
to play the later street. So how do you then, I get this question actually a lot and people have various ideas about it. So how do you then determine your bet size scheme? Let's say, for example, you open a part of the tree and there are some situations where a solver clearly, where like the heuristics are quite clear, right? You lean to a lot of big bets, you lean to a lot of small bets. But then there's some spots where it's like it bets 20% 1/3, 20% 3/4, 20% overbet. Now, what do you do?
Are we talking about on the flop?
This happens flop, sometimes on turn.
Sure. Definitely on the river,
So
obviously.
okay, yeah, I was gonna say. So how would that impact for you, flop, turn, river? How do you?
Yeah, so something on the flop, I think this is where coming up with the multi-flop subset, comes in, where you can say, okay, here's the GTO baseline. If I give PO like 30% pot, 50, 75, 125, what is the EV for the in position C better? And then let's say, all right, on this specific texture, I'm going to let it either bet half pot or check. And what is the EV? How much did I actually lose by, conceding that complexity? And what I found is a lot of the time you don't lose as much as you think you do. And so by, trying to simplify things of maybe just having one size on a particular texture on each flop, not each, you might not just have one size period. It could be,
Yeah, texture
more
based.
to texture based.
One size per texture.
Yeah. But you'll find that it's a lot of times a fraction of a percentage of the pot. And so this is something that can be really hard for a lot of poker players to accept if they want to accept it, is that, we want to feel like we're super smart when we're playing poker. Like we're so like I can do better than like a simple protocol of like just bet your bluffs like half the time or 70 whatever. I'm smarter than that. I know the blockers, I know the situation, yada yada yada. Most of the time, simple protocols and especially on early streets are just going to outperform, whatever Linus or whoever would really attempt to do.
Because you're more accurate, right?
I think that yeah, I mean, ultimately, you don't even need to debate it. It's like that's the benefit of it being scientific is like you can just measure how much EV is lost, and then if you want to, you can node block your own thing and experiment. Like, okay, if I had 4 sizings, how would I compose my range? And then you can see how much EV did I really lose compared to GTO.
Yeah,
and
compared
that can
to if
give you
I
a
would
sense.
build a range myself.
Right.
Yeah,
And then you get even another thing is that what you might do in the quiet of your own room, like, oh, you're so GTO, but maybe when you're actually playing, you're too busy using all your good hands for an overbet because you get excited because you have a set and you might not, I know it's kind of silly, but basically, and
I mean,
you might not use half pot as
you're
often.
describing population as a whole, right? Like it's easier to screw up a little bit with a strong hand and not find the, high card with
Sure.
the unblocker. It's that's a hand that's a little bit less intuitive, maybe. I do feel like just pick a sizing, and because in the end, like how you're gonna execute your strategy will actually determine your EV. Like you already said on the flop, give it any of the sizings. As long as if you bet small, then by all means, usually you bet a lot. If you bet big, then at least bet less. So the sizing is linked with the frequency. But if you then execute that the execution will always determine your EV, especially I think on the flop. It doesn't really matter what you change in the solver because EV will not really change that much because it's a solver. So whatever you give it, it will execute perfectly on a later street. And you might play the optimal sizing, but if on a later street you screw up, that strategy will actually not be optimal for you. So that was floppy, like you said, on earlier streets in general. Probably you do then the same on turn. Like you try to stick maybe to one sizing, keep your range intact as much as possible.
If you need to, because usually as you get to later, you might need 2 sizings. It depends on the situation. Like as things get more complicated, you might need to split more. But I'd say just trying to use as few sizings as you can and simplify as much as possible. And the other thing about just the flop is that you might have a certain exploitability, like let's say it's 0.3% of the pot, 0.4% of the pot. That's also with PO having clairvoyance over how you just constructed your range. But a real person doesn't know. First of all, they don't know how you constructed your range to begin with. Second of all, they don't know how to maximally exploit it anyway, even if they knew what you were doing. So in practice, it's usually like this is the worst case scenario is you lose this percentage of the pot, because that's the max exploit. In reality, it's going to be less than that.